We have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We have been drenched by many storms. We have learned the art of equivocation and pretense. Experience has made us suspicious of others and kept us from being truthful and open. Are we still of any use? Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Keines etwas zu leiden nun und von keinem ein Leid erdulden.
I think the most important thing that my uncle did was to realize from the start how evil Nazism was. Then I think how brave it was of this small group of people to think that they could fight together with other companions this monstrous machine, and that they were prepared to give their lives to do this.
You can almost sense that eventually he is going to somehow do something to put a spoke in the wheel of the Third Reich.
He could have such a very deep faith in God, even in the midst of incredible darkness.
He was so clever, and he knew so well theology, and he knew all the points in which I was a weak man. I liked chocolate, and he would bring me chocolate. He was my best friend.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in Breslau, Germany, February 1906, 10 minutes before his twin sister, Sabina. He was the sixth of 8 children and the youngest boy. His father, Karl Bonhoeffer, was a renowned psychiatrist and professor at the University of Berlin. His mother, Paula von Hase, came from a prominent family. Her grandfather was a chaplain of the Prussian court until he chastised the emperor for his attitude towards the poor and was dismissed. The Bonhoeffer home was in Grunewald, a privileged district on the outskirts of Berlin.
When the World War I broke out in 1914, the German churches unanimously supported the war effort. They were fully convinced by the propaganda that this war had been imposed on Germany by her encircling enemies out of a sense of envy, who wanted to stop the German developments, German cultural and spiritual and political expansion. They automatically became enthusiastic believers that indeed God was on their side.
Dietrich's older brother Walter volunteered for the front. He was 18. On the night before Walter's departure, the Bonhoeffer family gathered to say goodbye. Dietrich's twin sister remembered the evening.
Dietrich had, on his own initiative, practiced the song, "Now at last we say Godspeed on your journey." And in the evening before Walter left, he played it for him. The next day, we saw Walter off at the station. When the train started moving, my mother ran alongside, calling out to Walter, "It's only space that separates us." and for a long time those words moved us deeply. A fortnight later, Walter was killed.
It was a time, Bonhoeffer wrote, when death stood before the door of almost every house and called for entrance.
The millions of men returned from the war totally disillusioned and regarding the religious establishment as a bunch of hypocrites. The churches suffered a tremendous loss of credibility and therefore of support.
I think the death of Walter certainly had a part of an influence on him to enter the ministry and to study theology, where he would deal directly with the reality of death. It gave him a passion when he preached against war and when he became a known advocate of the pacifist solution to the problems of the world.
World War I left Germany and much of Europe in ruins. For the Allies, the peace treaty was designed to assure that Germany would never again bring the world to war. For many Germans, the terms were a national humiliation. In the years that followed, the monarchy was gone, replaced by a fragile democracy, and Germany became a nation of contrasts and change. In Berlin, professors, lawyers, and doctors often gathered around the Bonhoeffer table for debates about politics. Karl Bonhoeffer was an ardent supporter of the new Weimar government. The Bonhoeffer family held deep political convictions, but it was not very religious. So when Dietrich announced his plans to study theology, the family reacted with some shock.
The Bonhoeffer family is a very, very conservative, used to be a very conservative family, but conservative in the best way, you know, in the sense of being open for everything new, but never lose the roots where you're coming from, you know, and never lose the values you're coming from.
What you need to understand, I think, about Bonhoeffer in terms of the church was that his experience of the church as he grew up here in Germany during the Weimar period wasn't a very positive one. I mean, the family seldom went to church. The Bonhoeffers weren't great churchgoers. And even Bonhoeffer himself, even after he had decided to be a theologian, a pastor, didn't often go to church. And the reason was that, well, the church, well, yeah, it's important, I suppose, but, you know, you're an individual Christian and so forth, and the church is a society of people who belong together and perhaps worship from time to time. No sense of real fundamental community in which you discover who you really are in your relationship with other people and discover that that's the reality of Christ existing in the world today.
In 1924, Bonhoeffer began his studies in theology at the University of Berlin. It was a time when theology was being re-examined against the horrors of the Great War, and a young Swiss theologian, Karl Barth, was gaining fame.
Karl Barth's great observation was every part of the conflicting parties in the First World War reclaimed God for themselves, made of the one Christian God a tribal God of German, British, French people, and so on. This was a catastrophe for Christianity.
I think that what Barth was aiming his theology against in the aftermath of the Great War was the human pretentiousness that what human beings contrived to do would have God's blessing. Barth's insistence on the primacy of God's word as the dominating judge of all human behavior and as the source of all revelation, and therefore as the inner core of what a church is supposed to be, pleased Bonhoeffer very much.
At the age of 21, Bonhoeffer received his doctorate, summa cum laude. In his thesis, Bonhoeffer defined the Church as the physical manifestation of Christ on earth, Christ existing as community. He titled it Sanctorum Communio, the communion of saints. Karl Barth later called Sanctorum Communio a theological miracle.
Christ is really present only in the community. The Church is the presence of Christ, just as Christ is the presence of God. But our Church today is bourgeois. The best proof is that poor working classes have turned away from the Church, whereas the bourgeois, the petty officials, the artisans and the merchants have remained. When the community is split, is Christ himself divided?
It's astounding, really, that he was only 21 when he got his doctoral dissertation finished. He got involved in writing this dissertation, not primarily about the Church, but primarily about human community. From a Christian perspective, God intends us to be in relationship with others if we're going to be fully human. God's desire was not just for a whole bunch of individuals who happen to be Christian, but for a new community, a new humanity. And within that context, Bonhoeffer wanted to locate the Church as the means to that end.
But the notion of church as a way to create community was set against the growing anger on the streets of Germany. The late 1920s were a time of economic and political uncertainty, massive unemployment, and mounting inflation. Some called for the reinstatement of the monarchy, others for a communist revolution. The chaos provided the ideal climate for a new party of hardline nationalists that appealed both to industrial leaders and the working class, the National Socialists, led by Adolf Hitler.
Nun muss ich von mir selber sagen, ich stamme aus einem sehr national orientierten Elternhaus. Und ich habe als junger Mensch sogar einmal, noch als Schüler, der NSDAP angehört, war ein Mitglied dieser Partei. Ich war damals eben ein begeisterter Nationalist, so kann ich sagen. Und darum begrüßte ich auch die ersten Maßnahmen, die von Hitler also inauguriert wurden und auch die Verehrung, die er genoss.
In September 1930, as Hitler continued his rise, Dietrich Bonhoeffer sailed aboard the Columbus for New York.
Feel the way my heart keeps thumping. Notice how my true eyes shine. See the way my feet keep jumping.
The Roaring Twenties were over, and America was descending into a widespread depression.
I'm in the seventh heaven, it's easy to guess. My baby said yes, I know I've just thrown a great big seven.
Bonhoeffer came to New York on a teaching fellowship to Union Theological Seminary in Upper Manhattan. Initially, Bonhoeffer was disturbed by the casual classroom style, which was very different from the more rigid German approach. At Union, he studied under Reinhold Niebuhr, who often used the work of contemporary black writers to teach theology.
Reinhold Niebuhr is considered by many to be the father of social ethics in this country. He achieved fame because of the way he was able to criticize the social ills of the United States, offer practical solutions. Therefore, it's surprising when we read in Bonhoeffer's journal that he didn't like Reinhold Niebuhr. What he found lacking was the Christocentrism that he had come to admire in Karl Barth, and that, of course, became the centerpiece of his own writings at this time. But later, a lot of what Niebuhr was driving at came to enter into Bonhoeffer's own way of thinking, that the purpose of theology, the purpose of ethics, is to change this world for the better.
At Union Seminary, Bonhoeffer began a friendship with Franklin Fisher, one of Union's few black students. Fisher introduced Bonhoeffer to Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church. It was unlike anything Bonhoeffer had ever experienced.
King Jesus preaching to the poor.
I know the Lord's laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord. I know the Lord. I know the Lord's laid his hands on me.
It was a large, impressive stone building which had in its membership great pride that this was not a building worn out by white people and then sold to blacks. It was a building which they built for themselves. And it was just as big and just as impressive as any building that any white church had ever built. They had the best of preaching. A man like Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was a towering giant in the pulpit, as well as a physically towering giant with a mane of gray hair.
At Abyssinian, Bonhoeffer discovered a community encouraged by Powell to be emotional in the expression of their faith, and he witnessed for the first time the political and social engagement of a church.
Powell reflected the fact that throughout its history, the black church, the black pulpit had social conscience. So here was a man of considerable intelligence and training, a man of real passion, solid biblical commitment, who was also involved in the social issues of his time, the political issues of his time.
Bonhoeffer wrote home to his family.
I have had the chance to hear the Gospels preached in black churches. Here one can truly speak and hear about sin and grace and the love of God, if in forms we are not used to. In contrast to the often didactic style of white preaching, the black Christ is preached with rapturous passion and vision.
Bonhoeffer also wrote that, in America, blacks sing before audiences of whites who applaud them wildly, yet still deny them equal rights. Over the next months, Bonhoeffer taught Sunday school in Harlem, and he bought recordings of his favorite spirituals.
Apparently he did not come across as a kind of arrogant, paternalistic, know-it-all kind of guy, but someone who was eager to learn and humbled by the experience about what he did not fully understand, recognizing that there was something quite profound at work in the church.
Bonhoeffer began a friendship with another Union student that marked his life. Jean Lasserre was a deeply committed pacifist, and in the post-World War I era, when friendships between French and Germans were rare, the two became close. Lasserre told Bonhoeffer, "Nothing in scriptures gives a Christian the right to destroy the body of Christ."
The simple reading of the Sermon on the Mount compels one who is sincere to refuse to take part in the war, because almost everything a man does in warfare is contrary to the gospel and to the ethics of the gospel. And the drama is that for centuries the churches have said, well, but on the level of the country and defending the country, the gospel ethics is suspended. We are authorized not to respect it. And that was the point of our discussions.
I suppose if you had to ask people about what is Christianity all about, some would say it's putting into practice what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. The question then is, well, how does one love one's enemy? What does it mean that blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the earth, and those kinds of things? What does all this mean? In traditional German Lutheranism, the Sermon on the Mount was so impossible for anybody to keep that the way in which it was handled traditionally was to say that the Sermon on the Mount made us aware of how sinful we are because we just can't do any of that. Lasserre helps Bonhoeffer to understand that the Sermon on the Mount isn't simply something to make us feel sinful, something to put into practice. Now, this stayed with Bonhoeffer from that time onwards, which was quite a fresh thought that Jesus actually intended us to live like this.
While in America, Bonhoeffer read accounts of the mounting economic crisis in Germany.
7 million unemployed. That is 15 or 20 million people hungry. I don't know how Germany or the individual will survive it. Will our church survive yet another catastrophe, one wonders? Will it not really be the end? Unless we become something completely different.
In the summer of 1931, Bonhoeffer left America and returned home.
Das deutsche Volk ist nicht mehr das Volk der Ehrenlosigkeit, der Schande, der Selbstabfleischung, der Kleinmütigkeit und Kleingläubigkeit. Nein, Herr, das deutsche Volk ist wieder stark geworden.
Hitler often spoke about the Almighty, and the Almighty was behind the scenery of the destiny of the German people.
Herr, wir lassen nicht von dir, nun segne unseren Kampf unsere Freiheit und damit unser deutsches Volk und Vaterland.
So this was a completely ideological God who justified the own estimations and own expectations of the people, who justified the exclusion of others, who justified the idea of a superiority of the German people.
Ich kann es von der evangelischen Kirche sagen, nur die war durch ihre ganze Geschichte hindurch natürlich sehr obrigkeitshörig, obrigkeitstreu. Der Verlust des Krieges, des Ersten Weltkrieges 1918, der Sturz der Monarchie, Begründung der Republik, wurde von den Christen zumeist als großes Unglück empfunden. Hitler versprach gleich Beseitigung aller demokratischen Denkweisen, keine Republik, sondern Führerstaat, eine direkte Fortsetzung der Monarchie, aber nun eben nicht mit einem Adligen, sondern mit dem von Gott gesandten Führer Adolf Hitler. Insofern kann man sagen, die Kirche war mit schuld daran, dass der Boden für Hitler und seine Partei vorbereitet war.
On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany.
Immer und immer wieder predige ich, der Wiederaufstieg der deutschen Nation ist die Frage der Wiedergewinnung der inneren Kraft und Gesundheit des deutschen Volkes. Da will
wir bauen und arbeiten an der Wiederaufrichtung unseres deutschen Volkes. Deshalb habe ich mich bereit erklärt, am 30. Januar die unter des von 7 Mann zu 12 Millionen emporgewachsene Bewegung einzusetzen zur Rettung des deutschen Volkes und Vaterlandes.
Two days later, as Germany continued celebrating its new leader, Bonhoeffer spoke by radio to a national audience. He was 3 days shy of his 27th birthday, yet he delivered one of the first public criticisms of the new chancellor in a speech entitled, "The Younger Generation's Changed View of the Concept of Führer."
Should the leader allow himself to succumb to the wishes of those he leads, who will always seek to turn him into an idol? Then the image of the leader will become the image of the misleader. This is the leader who makes an idol of himself and his office, and who thus mocks God.
Before Bonhoeffer could finish his talk, the broadcast was cut off. In March, Hitler celebrated the start of spring and the reopening of the newly elected Reichstag at the historic Garrison Church in Potsdam. The event was to symbolize the start of a new nation built on traditional values.
There is no doubt that a great many church people fell for this. They wanted to have this kind of leadership. They were desperately anxious to get the churches back into the mainstream of national life. How could they restore their credibility? How could they restore their congregations?
Throughout its history, the Protestant Church of Germany was comprised of independent regional churches. But growing out of the new nationalism, Nazi sympathizers helped to establish the first united Reich Church of Germany.
When Reich Bishop Ludwig Müller was installed, he announced in his sermon that the struggle for the church was over, that the struggle for the soul of the people had just begun. And I think that was the struggle in which the church found itself as of January 30th, 1933, whether it was aware of this or not, that it was doing battle with an ideological dictatorship, a totalitarian regime that really wasn't interested in preserving the Christian church. It was interested in maintaining its own ideology and gaining total control.
As Hitler enjoyed growing support within the churches, Bonhoeffer continued to teach theology in Berlin.
Und dann lernte ich in dieser Vorlesung, dieser ersten Vorlesung bei Bonhoeffer,
dort vortrug, das war genau das Heilmittel gegen das, was in der Öffentlichkeit geschah.
Heute Morgen um 10 Uhr hat der Boykott begonnen. Er wird bis um die Mitternachtsstunde fortgesetzt. Er vollzieht sich mit einer schlagartigen Wucht, aber auch mit einer imponierenden Manneszucht und Disziplin. Heil!
Bonhoeffer's grandmother, Julie Toffel, refused to comply with the Jewish boycott, and that day went to her usual shops.
The Nazi men, the SR troops, stormtroopers, which stood there before it and were supposed not to let the people go in. This 90-year-old woman, they just couldn't do anything against her. They didn't hold her up, and she came out again then with her shopping and said, "I buy there where I always used to buy my things." Dietrich's mother was very keen on the church to do something. She asked Dietrich and his friend, what is the church going to do? The church has got to do something about the Jewish question.
1 week after the boycott, the Nazis instituted the Aryan Paragraph, new laws that prohibited people of Jewish ancestry from holding positions in civil service. For many, the laws only legalized anti-Jewish sentiments in the church, dating back to Martin Luther.
Die Stellungnahme Martin Luthers zu den Juden, das ist ein nicht einfacher Prozess. Denn oft wird vergessen, dass in der Anfangszeit sehr judenfreundliche Überlegungen geäußert hat und dass Juden mit ihm Kontakt aufgenommen haben. Seine Hoffnung aber war, die Juden würden sich zum Christentum bekehren. Dieses ist nicht eingetreten. Und so ist es auch zu einer Wende gekommen. Und Luther ist Antisemit geworden und ein radikaler Antisemit, und seine letzten Schriften vom Shem Hafuras und dergleichen mehr enthalten Vorschläge zur Verfolgung von Juden in Deutschland.
We have to distinguish clearly anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. It's not in order to give any excuse for the anti-Judaistic tradition in Christian theology and Christian life. But we understand the situation of the 20th century only when we realize that an additional, namely racist element came to it. Luther's anti-Judaism is not racist. It is an anti-Judaism which grows out of faith. He sees a conflict of faith between Jews and Christians. And he gives a completely wrong interpretation of it. But what comes during the 19th century, the identification of a theological conflict with a racist interpretation, this brings the dynamic which leads up to the cruelties of the Nazi regime.
Soon, the climate of anti-Semitism affected Bonhoeffer directly. His twin sister Sabina was married to Gerhard Leipholtz, who was of Jewish ancestry. When Gerhard's father died, Bonhoeffer was asked to preach at the funeral. He declined.
He consulted the church authorities who advised him not to do it. Obviously, they were being very cautious in view of the National Socialist policies towards the church and towards the Jew at the time. Bonhoeffer later on was dreadfully ashamed that he had gone along with that advice.
I am tormented by the thought that I did not do as you asked me as a matter of course. To be honest, I cannot think what made me behave as I did. How could I have been so afraid at the time? So, all I can do is ask you to forgive my weakness then. I know now for certain that I ought to have behaved differently. Dietrich.
Against mounting anti-Jewish sentiment, Bonhoeffer delivered a talk to fellow pastors entitled The Church and the Jewish Question. In it, Bonhoeffer issued a direct challenge to the church to stand with the Jews.
We can say that Bonhoeffer was one of the first, if not the first, German evangelical theologian to make a statement of this kind, which indicated that the church couldn't stand by and let this happen without doing something about it.
The Church has three possible ways it can act against the state. First, it can ask the state if its actions are legitimate. Second, it can aid the victims of the state action. The Church has the unconditional obligation to the victims of any order in society, even if they do not belong to the Christian society. The third possibility is not just bandage the victims under the wheel, but to jam a spoke in the wheel itself.
Clearly, the Church and the Jewish Christian is a watershed moment. It's a document in which you can almost sense that eventually he is going to somehow do something to put a spoke in the wheel of the Third Reich.
It's so easy to be sucked in by the structures and to be sucked in too by a false kind of loyalty and ending up maybe with a false church. When God grabs you by the scruff of the neck, then although theoretically you have a freedom to say no, in another sense, actually, you can't say no because it's like Jeremiah. God, you have cheated me. You called me to be a prophet against a people that I love, and all that I proclaim is words of doom and judgment. And yet if I say I will shut up, I can't.
In the south of Germany, where National Socialism had its start, the majority religion was traditionally Roman Catholic. From the beginning, Catholic political groups resisted Hitler's rise. But by the summer of 1933, their fear for the loss of freedoms under a Hitler government brought Catholic leadership to the negotiation table. Nazi leaders met with representatives of the Vatican, including Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pope Pius XII. Together, they signed a Concordat that promised the Catholic Church autonomy in exchange for its pledge not to organize against the regime. It was one of Hitler's first diplomatic victories.
The Concordat undoubtedly provided the new regime with increased status. But more importantly, it negatived the possibility that the Catholic Church would, in fact, organize resistance to the regime. And unfortunately, of course, this was because the majority of the bishops, Catholic bishops, assumed that Adolf Hitler was a Catholic and that he would behave legally and conservatively. That was the widespread assumption.
But the excesses of the Nazis, the use of force in their pursuit of power, and their intrusion into the workings of the Church began to disturb even the most loyal Protestant pastors. Martin Niemöller, a decorated hero in World War I and now a prominent pastor in Berlin, led a protest, particularly against the Aryan Clause. Together with Bonhoeffer, he tapped into a growing resentment of Nazi policies and created the Pastors' Emergency League. Over time, more than 7,000 pastors joined, yet the majority of the 20,000 pastors refused. For Bonhoeffer, the growing division within the Church was deeply troubling. He wrote to Karl Barth.
I felt that I was in radical opposition to all my friends, that my views of matters were taking me more and more into isolation. And I saw no reason why I should see these things more correctly than so many able and good pastors to whom I looked up.
Bonhoeffer removed himself from the crisis by accepting a position with a German church in London, England. He began a friendship with Bishop George Bell of Chichester. What they shared in common was a belief in the ecumenical movement, both as a way to renew the church and as a way to build a lasting peace. With Bell's help, Bonhoeffer received an invitation to travel to India to study nonviolent resistance under Gandhi. Back home, the Gestapo intensified its harassment of dissident pastors, and many were jailed. Hitler Youth threw a bomb into the parsonage of Martin Niemöller after he preached a sermon entitled, "God is my Führer." By May 1934, many churchmen had reached a point of decision. More than 100 gathered in the city of Barmen and issued a statement of civil disobedience written principally by Karl Barth. The Barmen Declaration established the basis of a breakaway group known as the Confessing Church.
We confessed Christ because we were obeying now the Barmen Declaration and no other powers in the church, refusing to obey the modern Nazified beliefs.
But it's very interesting at Barmen, nothing is said about the Jews at all. And when Bonhoeffer comes back 18 months later, after he had gone to London, and becomes involved in the church struggle again, in the first instance, it's a struggle around the question of the church's freedom to preach the gospel, not around the Jewish question. But then gradually, Bonhoeffer recognizes that the real question is not the freedom of the church to preach the gospel. The real issue is the freedom of the church to actually stand by the victims.
As the Nazis began to remilitarize Germany, religious leaders from around the world gathered in the seacoast town of Fanø, Denmark. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was 28, yet already emerging as one of the leaders in the world ecumenical movement that called for closer collaboration among the faiths. Bonhoeffer was asked to speak on the church and the people of the world. He traveled there with a group of his students, including Inge Zabritsky and Otto Dutzes.
Bonhoeffer hatte gleich alles abgestellt auf den zu erwartenden und bevorstehenden Krieg, der in Vorbereitung war, wie er wusste, und hatte auch seine Thesen nun darauf ausgerichtet, was kann die Ökumene zur Erhaltung des Friedens tun. Und von Genf aus, von dem Sekretär Schönfeld, wurden Bonhoeffer seine Thesen zurückgeschickt. Sie seien unzureichend und er müsse viel allgemeiner über die Frage Kirche und Staat sprechen. Aber Bonhoeffer dachte nicht daran. Was er in den Thesen schon vorgelegt hatte, präzisierte er dann in dem Vortrag, den er hielt und der ausschließlich ein Appell zum Frieden war.
There is no way to peace along the way of safety. For peace has to be dared. It is the great venture. It can never be safe. Peace is the opposite of security. To demand guarantees is to mistrust, and this mistrust in turn brings forth war. Battles are won, not with weapons, but with God.
Meine Erinnerung an Bonhoeffers Fanø-Rede ist so deutlich. Es mündete ja in den Appell an die christlichen Kirchen auf der Erde, dass wir uns gegen diese Kriegsgefahr aufständen und uns dagegen wehren. Und daher hießen diese letzten Sätze, worauf warten wir noch? Es ist allerhöchste Zeit.
In 1935, the renegade Confessing Church needed seminaries for the training of new ministers. Bonhoeffer postponed his planned trip to India and instead accepted the position as director of the seminary near Germany's northern coast in a town called Finkenwalde.
I think I'm right in saying that I would only achieve true inner clarity and sincerity by really starting to take the Sermon on the Mount seriously. This is the only source of strength that can blow all this nonsense sky high. The restoration of the Church will surely come from a new kind of monasticism, which will have nothing in common with the old, but a life of adherence to the Sermon on the Mount, in imitation of Christ. I believe the time has come to rally people together for this.
What Bonhoeffer set out to create was a community centered on study, mutual service, and prayer. Adolf Hitler, who had become Bonhoeffer's closest friend, was part of that first Finkenwalde class.
You couldn't make a difference between him and the students because he was so young too and looked very strong, sporty. But he greeted me then and went with me alone first away from the group and asked who I was and where I came from and what I had done and what I had experienced, and asked me about my family, a way which a professor would never do. It was a rather surprising beginning. So that was the Herr Director, and a few days later he asked us not to say Herr Director, but to say to him, Brother Bonhoeffer, Bruder Bonhoeffer.
Wir mussten morgens, wie gesagt, immer unsere Betten selbst machen, sie in Ordnung bringen. Und Bonhoeffer machte nachher mit uns zusammen einen Stubendurchgang und begutachtete, wie gut wir unsere Betten gemacht hatten. Eines Tages sahen wir also ein Bett, das ganz fürchterlich, was gar nicht gut gemacht war, sondern sehr schlecht. Die Decken lagen zum Teil an der Erde und der Besitzer dieses Bettes hieß Eberhard Bethke.
Now, I was very interested in singing, and I was teaching them Agnus Dei, excellent piece. In the house of the Bonhoeffers, there was done a lot of music, but always in the time of Bach and after Bach. So Heinrich Schütz and Gumpelsheim and all these, that was totally new to him. And so it started that we together tried to study in them. That, in a way, was the beginning of our friendship.
Bonhoeffer used not only classical and traditional sacred music, but the spirituals he discovered in Harlem were now an important part of life at Finkenwalde.
Coming forth to carry me home.
Bonhoeffer hatte sehr viele Platten und diese Musik war also auf seinen Platten und die wurden sehr oft vorgespielt und wir liebten sie. Wir hatten zuerst, fanden wir sie vielleicht etwas eigenartig, aber je länger wir sie hörten, umso mehr wurden wir von dieser Art Frömmigkeit, dieser unterdrückten Farbigen doch beeindruckt. Sie waren vielleicht für uns vorher nur Menschen am Rande der Welt, aber wir fanden jetzt, dass sie doch auch uns Christen etwas zu sagen hätten. Er sah jedenfalls Parallelen zwischen der Unterdrückung der Schwarzen und der Unterdrückung der Juden. Und ich nehme auch an, dass er sich deshalb auch für die Juden gleich so sehr eingesetzt hat, weil er diese Erfahrungen in den USA gemacht hatte.
All die Kandidaten Dietrich Bonhoeffers in Finkenwalde waren ja an einem illegalen Predigerseminar. Und das ist etwas, was es im lutherischen Protestantismus über all die Jahrhunderte niemals zuvor gegeben hatte. Das heißt, die ganzen Kandidaten, junge Menschen, die heiraten wollten, Familien gründen wollten, bekamen kein Geld vom Staat, sondern sie lebten von den Freiwilliggaben der Gemeinden da um Zingst und in Finkenwalde. Sie waren angewiesen, ja, auf die Zuwendung von Gemeinden.
One person who helped support the seminary was a local aristocrat, Ruth von Kleist.
Our whole family was pious and conservative, and so we didn't like the Nazi regime. Our grandmother very soon took us 5 grandchildren to Finkenwalde, and so we sat in the very primitive chapel. Everybody was caught by the way Dietrich was preaching. We hadn't heard this way because he was caught by what he said more than I had ever seen another person. Grandmother was interested in theology, and soon after the service they began to talk, and soon a friendship started between her and him and Eberhard Bethke and all those people of the seminary.
During his time at Finkenwalde, Bonhoeffer wrote the book Discipleship. In it, he explored the theme of grace as cheap grace and costly grace.
Cheap grace is grace without the cross. Grace without the living, incarnate Jesus Christ. Costly grace is the gospel. It costs people their lives. It costs the life of God's Son, and nothing can be cheap to us, which is costly to God.
For nearly 2 years, the seminary remained open. But in September 1937, the Gestapo closed Finkenwalde.
Dass das nationalsozialistische Deutschland keine Feindschaft mit anderen Völkern will. Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
On November 9, 1938, a series of coordinated anti-Jewish riots broke out across Germany and Austria. It was Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Thousands of Jewish-owned shops were looted, and nearly 300 synagogues were desecrated or destroyed. Bonhoeffer wrote, "Only he who cries out for the Jews may sing Gregorian chants." But on Kristallnacht, the confessing church was silent.
Bonhoeffers Bibel, die er benutzte, ist nur eine einzige Stelle angestrichen. Und zwar die, die sich auf die Zerstörung des Tempels in Jerusalem bezog, Psalm 74. Er hat in der Zerstörung der Synagogen und in allem, was damit verbunden war, einen Angriff auf, nicht nur auf die Juden gesehen, sondern überhaupt auf den Gott des Alten und des Neuen Testamentes und auch auf die christliche Kirche.
Bonhoeffer took refuge at the home of his parents in Berlin. Members of the Bonhoeffer family were now deeply involved in the resistance. including Dietrich's brother Klaus and his brothers-in-law Rüdiger Schleicher and Hans von Dohnanyi. Von Dohnanyi was a lawyer working in the Abwehr, Germany's military counterintelligence office. So from the beginning, he had access to information about Nazi atrocities. The Abwehr secretly became a center for resistance activities and the plots to kill Hitler.
Hitler knew that he had enemies, particular enemies. He knew in the first place that every head of state has enemies, every head of government has enemies, and must expect some of them to try to kill him. So he knew that, and he tried to prepare for it. He allowed security details to exist and to protect him, to follow him in armored cars and all of that. But he also believed that unpredictability was a great protection against assassination attacks. If no one knew where he was going to be in the next 2 hours or in the next 2 days, then they couldn't plan an assassination.
They became political activists because this was the only way of fighting the system. Many people in those days most likely didn't realize what Hitler already did in those days. This absolutely stupid and fanatic racism. And as a man who knows so much about this, and my father knew about all these things, you see, you had to go against it. You know, I would be ashamed if he wouldn't have done it.
By the summer of 1939, Karl Barth had been expelled from Germany. Martin Niemöller was in a concentration camp, and hundreds of clergy were in prison. Bonhoeffer's friends arranged for him to return to New York and again take a teaching position at Union Theological Seminary.
Ehe rüberging, war ja, kurz vorher noch mal mit einem Kreis seiner Schüler und Freunde zusammen. Wir waren etwa ein Kreis von 10 oder 12 Leuten. Bonhoeffer erzählte uns, warum er nach Amerika geht. Und wir sprachen dann auch über die Weiterführung seiner Arbeit, wie das weitergehen sollte, und haben über viele notwendige und gute Dinge miteinander gesprochen. Und zwischendurch fragte er uns ganz unvermutet, ob wir einem Tyrannenmörder die Absolution erteilen würden. Merkwürdige Frage. Wir dachten also, Bonhoeffer will dieses alte Thema mal zur Diskussion stellen. Der einzige von den Anwesenden wusste um Bonhoeffers Verwicklung in den Widerstand. Eberhard Bethke.
The killing of the Jews. Well, that was well known in the Bonhoeffer family, and it was so clear that you couldn't just be silent.
That summer, Bonhoeffer sailed again for New York, this time with grave misgivings.
The ethical question that people normally ask is, what does it mean to do good? Bonhoeffer never asks that question. He says that's the wrong point to start. What we've got to ask is, and this may sound somewhat anachronistic in our secular age, what is the will of God? In other words, what is required of us at this moment in our lives that we are called to do?
There's no shaft of light that comes from heaven and says to you, okay, my son or my daughter, you are right. You have to hold on to it by the skin of your teeth and hope that there is going to be vindication on the other side.
Und an einem dieser Tage, als er sich fragte, in New York umherwandernd, wo werde ich gebraucht? Brauchen Sie mich in Deutschland? Brauchen Sie mich hier in Amerika? Stieß er auf eine Losung des Propheten Jesaja: Wer glaubt, der flieht nicht. Ich denke, in diesem Moment hat er überhaupt erst begriffen, was er getan hatte. Nämlich, er war weggegangen. Er war geflohen. Er hatte das Leben gewählt. Amerika war der Hort der Freiheit damals. Und indem er Amerika gewählt hatte, hatte er das Leben gewählt.
I have made a mistake in coming to America. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice in security.
Und so nimmt er das allerletzte Schiff, ja, das vor Kriegsbeginn von Amerika nach Europa geht und fährt zurück dem Krieg und der Konspiration entgegen.
In September 1939, German troops invaded Poland, and World War II began. Hans von Dohnanyi was now a leading member of the conspiracy that was planning the assassination of Hitler and the creation of a new government for Germany. He asked his brother-in-law, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, to join him.
My father and Dietrich became so close friends, and he actually needed Dietrich also for certain missions. Most likely they had very interesting discussions about this because it was a problem, and it is a problem, especially for somebody who's coming from the very religious side. It's a tremendous problem to be part of a complot, you know.
To ask that principal question, a Christian shall not kill, which is true, but there are times you are responsible for human beings around you. And you have to try to think about all means to stop that man who is killing.
Diese beiden Punkte, Krieg und Judenverfolgung, also Ungerechtigkeit, das waren die Punkte, die Bonhoeffer bewogen hat, sich dem Widerstand anzuschließen. Denn es war ja so, gerade der gegenwärtige Christus, gerade Gott in Christus, ist ja ein Gott des Friedens und ein Gott der Gerechtigkeit. Und man wird ihm nicht gerecht, wenn man eben eine laxe Auffassung vom Krieg hat und von der Gerechtigkeit. Und ich glaube, dass das für einen Mann wie Bonhoeffer ganz klar war. Und er hat ja auch deutlich gesagt, hat auch an Eberhard Bethge geschrieben, ich bereue diesen Weg an keiner Stelle.
Bonhoeffer's role in the resistance was more as an emissary between the core resistors and the Allied forces to get terms of surrender. He was also the moral backbone of the German resistance. They looked to him for moral guidance to help them overcome some of the scruples that they had, because in most instances, they had to violate their military oath. They had to lie, they had to be duplicitous, they had to plan murder, they had to kill the head of state. And Bonhoeffer certainly provided a moral inspiration to them.
As a member of the Abwehr, Bonhoeffer was given papers to travel outside Germany, supposedly to gather intelligence for the Nazis. Instead, he used the opportunity to meet with his many church contacts and pass on information about the conspiracy. Bonhoeffer was now a double agent in the plots to kill Hitler.
You are living now, and not tomorrow, and not yesterday. But now, in your name, are people killed and killed and killed. And that man you have to stop by all means, even then by taking over the guilt of killing him.
In the early years of the war, the German march seemed unstoppable. In May 1940, France surrendered. The vindication Hitler sought for the defeat of Germany in World War I had been accomplished.
Trocadero. Ein Blick auf den Eiffelturm. Links vom Führer Professor Speer.
Hitler returned home to one of the largest celebrations in the history of Berlin. Shortly after, Bonhoeffer traveled east to the home of his Finkenwalde patron, Ruth von Kleist. There he renewed a friendship begun earlier with her granddaughter, Maria von Wiedemeyer.
Bonhoeffer had been advising his seminarians that these were no times to be thinking of getting engaged and getting married, and then the next thing we know, he is in fact very interested in Maria von Wiedemeyer. Why is that? She was a very beautiful woman. She was very vivacious, very lively. I'm sure that Bonhoeffer saw in her, young as she was, a person who would be a good match for him.
I think both Maria and he were in some sense lonely people. When she met Dietrich again, after she had met him just as a child, very soon afterwards her father was killed in the war. And some time afterwards her very, very beloved brother. And so Dietrich started to be for her father and brother. This was a help. He could console her.
As Bonhoeffer traveled in his dual role as pastor and conspirator, he began writing the book he hoped would be his greatest achievement, Ethics.
The will of God is not a system of rules established from the outset. It is something new and different in each different situation in life. And for this reason a man must forever re-examine what the will of God may be. The will of God may lie deeply concealed beneath a great number of possibilities.
One of the things he ends up with is this sense of ethical behavior not as being grounded in a set of principles, but in the willingness to open oneself to God and do God's command. It's an act of faith. I think this is what keeps him going at this point. This is how he is operating. But even as he is operating this way, he's thinking about this all the time. Well, you know, if I'm doing this, if I'm living in this way, what does that really mean?
Some members of the conspiracy also took part in a plan that eventually helped some 14 Jews escape Germany. Von Dohnanyi, Bonhoeffer, and others arranged for Jews to be enlisted in the Abwehr and given papers to travel outside the country, pretending to gather information for the Nazis. The escapees would report back initially, but then vanish across Europe. In 1942, Bonhoeffer traveled to Sweden to meet again with his friend Bishop Bell of England. Bonhoeffer entrusted him with the details about the conspiracy, including the names of its key members. Bonhoeffer asked Bell, a member of Parliament, to inform the British government in the hopes the Allies would offer support.
I raised the general question myself in the House of Lords. I was told the cleansing of Germany was a German duty,
to be performed for its own sake, and that no promises in advance could be expected from the Allies. The silence of the British government was a bitter blow.
The response was a deep disappointment to the members of the resistance. Several of their plots to kill Hitler had failed, and there now seemed to be little hope for support from the outside. At Christmas 1942, Bonhoeffer wrote an essay to his fellow conspirators entitled, "After 10 Years, a reflection on a decade under Hitler."
We have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated. In short, from the perspective of those who suffer. Mere waiting and looking on is not Christian behavior. Christians are called to compassion and action.
His Christmas letter to several of his co-conspirators is a remarkable document because there he is really trying to bring it all together. What the resistance has meant for them, what it has done to them as human beings, what it holds for them in terms of hopes or options for the future. Our purpose as responsible people is not to come out of this looking good. It's what kind of world we pass on to future generations.
By 1943, the Allies had already begun to turn the tide of the war. Many former members of the Finkenwalde class were now soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front. In Berlin, the Gestapo had become suspicious of certain Abwehr agents. Bonhoeffer and von Donani's telephones were tapped. Despite the danger, Bonhoeffer proposed to Maria von Wiedemeyer.
We have grown together in a different way than we have thought and wished, but these are unusual times and will remain so a while longer. And everything depends on our being one in the essential things and on our remaining with each other. Your Dietrich.
There's a very haunting photograph of the Bonhoeffer family taken in March 1943 at Karl Bonhoeffer's 75th birthday, where you have the entire family assembled. And if you look at the faces of the conspirators, these are the faces of people that are really struggling to remain true to their principles and to do what they think is right, not knowing whether it's going to succeed, and not even knowing if it succeeded, if history will judge them right or not.
At that same gathering, the von Donani group awaited word that a bomb they had planted on a plane had succeeded in killing Hitler. But the bomb failed to detonate. On April 5, 1943, Gestapo agents arrived at Abwehr headquarters and arrested Hans von Donani. Papers in his desk led to Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
At about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Dietrich's father came from the number 43 to the 42 and said, "Dietrich, there are 2 gentlemen who wanted to speak to you. You must come over." And so Dietrich went over, of course, always in total discipline, being prepared that something like that one day will happen, and now it happened.
I didn't know then, but from that moment, she wrote every day a letter to him in her diary. On the 5th of April, when Dietrich was taken in prison, in this diary are the words, "Dear Dietrich, has something bad happened? I feel it's something very bad." But she didn't know.
Bonhoeffer was taken to Tegel prison in Berlin. The blanket he was given was so dirty that for days he refused to use it. Yet he wrote to his parents that he was well and expected to be released shortly.
I want you to be quite sure that I am all right. Strangely enough, the discomforts that one generally associates with the prison life, the physical hardship, hardly bother me at all. You can imagine that I am most particularly anxious about my fiancée at this moment. It is a great deal for her to bear. Here in the prison yard, there is a thrush that sings beautifully in the morning. Your Dietrich.
When I saw him first time, I didn't know how to behave. I thought, how shall I now? What shall I make? What a kind of face should I make when he comes in? But when he came in, he was just as he always was, friendly, smiling, and making that first seeing again each other very easy.
Over time, Bonhoeffer befriended several of the prison guards. Their assistance enabled Bonhoeffer to exchange correspondence and books with family and friends. The family devised a coding system within the books as a way to confirm each other's stories for the interrogations.
They actually communicated by, I think, every second page, or maybe every page, but I think most likely every second page, they put under one letter a little dot with a pencil. You know, and you would have to really look at it. And so the books were allowed to be sent in and to be to get back from the prison. So there was one letter, an E, a little dot under the E, then maybe a page later or 2 pages later, I don't know exactly how it was, the pattern, then another one letter. So you had a whole book for a few sentences, you see. And this was, of course, pretty clever. And they had time to know exactly how they would communicate because they knew they were in danger.
The interrogations must have been terrible. They were tortured. Klaus Bonhoeffer, before he died, wrote to his wife and said, "I can go through anything. I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be interrogated again." I think that the ugliness and depravity and brutality of the Nazis and the knowledge that Bonhoeffer and other members of his family had about what was really going on would have done many people in, would have simply immobilized them. And one of the most remarkable things for me is how he doesn't become paralyzed, how he continues to try again and again and again. Not just to do the right thing, but to think about what this really means in the long term, in the universal sense for his church.
One of the things that Bonhoeffer was trying to do in prison was to write a book. We have the outline of that book. It's there in the papers from prison, but we don't have much of the material. What we do have is correspondence between him and Eberhard Bethke, his friend, about the book that he was writing.
Bonhoeffer wrote to Bethke, "The church is the church only when it exists for others. It must share in the secular problems of ordinary life, and it must tell men of every calling what it means to live in Christ."
It goes back to the whole question of the other. You see, religion had become a very individualistic thing as a result of the Enlightenment, and a thing between you and God, okay? And something that you kept separate from politics. That's what it was, and that's not what Christianity is about.
Dietrich was already 3 months in prison when for the first time Maria was allowed to see him. But the judge wanted to be present, and they only told him 1 minute before when he came in, and Maria came from the other side. And they were taught to sit down on a little sofa and not to touch, and to talk loudly so that the others could understand what they talked. And so after half an hour, I can't imagine what they talked, but perhaps not so important things. Then each of them had to go out. Dietrich at the one door, and Maria at the other door. And when they arrived at the doors, Maria turned on her heels and ran to him before anybody could stop her and put her arms round his neck.
One of my predecessors here has scribed over the cell door, "In 100 years it will be over." I am reading the Bible straight through from cover to cover, and I have just got as far as Job, which I am particularly fond of. I read the Psalms every day, as I have for years. I know them and love them more than any other book.
As the war continued into 1944, Bonhoeffer became more and more resigned to his situation. Again, he began working on his book, Ethics.
One of the things he says in Ethics is that the old kind of ethics doesn't work anymore, that the rules have changed so radically under Nazism that the only thing someone can do really is throw themselves on the mercy of God and do what they think is right and follow it through. And that's what you see him doing.
On July 20th, 1944, the resistance launched its final attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg carried a bomb contained in a briefcase into a meeting with Hitler and his generals in East Prussia. Von Stauffenberg armed the device in a room next to the meeting, but was able to activate only half the explosives in the case.
When Stauffenberg walked into the room, he asked an aide to place him near Hitler so that he could follow everything that was being said, because his hearing was somewhat impaired through having been wounded in North Africa. And he was placed about 2 persons away from Hitler. It seems that after he had left, someone shoved the briefcase further under the table, under the great map table, which was had a very heavy tabletop, and that may have protected Hitler somewhat.
The bomb destroyed the bunker, killing many of the officers. But Hitler was only wounded.
After the explosion, and after Hitler had survived the explosion, Hitler was, of course, at first furious, then elated, then furious again, but he was very much elated, and he said, it's a miracle, I've survived, I'm invulnerable.
Hitler vowed to kill all the members of the conspiracy. The fate of von Dohnanyi and Bonhoeffer was effectively sealed.
Who am I? I have been told that I suffer the days of misfortune with serenity, smiles and pride, as someone accustomed to victory. Am I really what others say about me? Or am I only what I know of myself, bedeviled by anxiety, awaiting great events that might never occur, fearfully powerless and worried for friends far away, weary and empty in prayer, thinking, doing, weak, and ready to take leave of it all? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, you know me. Oh God, you know I'm yours.
By April 1945, Berlin was in total ruin. Despite the fact the war was lost, the order was given to kill the remaining members of the resistance group, including Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was moved south to Flossenburg concentration camp. Upon arriving, he was brought before a court-martial. Witnesses say he did not offer a defense for himself. He was found guilty and condemned to death. On the morning of April 9, 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was marched naked to the gallows and hanged. He said, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." On the same day, his brother-in-law Hans von Dohnanyi was executed. Shortly after, his brother Klaus and brother-in-law Rüdiger Schleicher were also killed.
With Dietrich, we always had still hope that he might come back. But then, I think it was in June, my grandparents switched on the news from the BBC. And then they suddenly heard they had a service in memory of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And that was the way how we came to know that he was dead.
I do never forget the expression of her face when she said, Rütterlis Dietrich lebt nicht mehr. Dietrich is dead.
This is perhaps the most important letter to me, which he wrote on the 21st of July, the day after the plot had failed, 44. I discovered later, and I'm still discovering right up to this moment, that is it only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith. By this worldliness, I mean living unreservedly in life's duties, problems, successes, and failures. In so doing, we throw ourselves completely into the arms of God, taking seriously not our own sufferings, but those of God in the world. That, I think, is faith.